Thank you very much for joining you, everyone. A very warm welcome to Leipzig Lectures on Language. Today with already our 8th installment of our online lecture series on combinatorics in language. And in this lecture series, we aim to answer questions such as, what information do we combine in language? Is this process domain specific or domain general? And how does the brain support combinatorics in language? And the hallmark of our lecture series is that we invite so-called tandems of speakers, in which we provide a platform to more junior researchers who get the opportunity to talk about their work, and they are being introduced by a more senior speaker who is well known in the field. So here you see our lineup. So many, before the summer, we already had many excellent speakers. And today it's my privilege to welcome Giulio Degano and Narly Golestani. I will briefly introduce the speakers. So Giulio is postdoctoral researcher in the Brain and Language Lab at the University of Geneva. And his research interests include the perception of the naturalistic stimuli such as speech, music, and multisensory integration. And Narly Golestani is at the University of Geneva and at the University of Vienna. And here, her research focuses on the neural basis of auditory and language processing, using a range of neuroimaging techniques to study questions on language learning, multilingualism, and individual differences. And today they will talk about combining prosodic and syntactic information in the brain during listening to naturalistic speech. We're very excited to have you here. Just some brief participation guidelines for the audience. We would like to ask everyone to keep their microphones muted. And we encourage everyone to post questions throughout the talk. So on whichever medium you're joining us, this can be on YouTube or on Zoom. And please preface your question with a little Q followed by your name so that we know where the questions came from. And if you're a junior researcher, you can add a little QJ to note that you're a junior researcher, and we'll give priority to those questions. And then there's the Twitter option using the hashtag Leipzig21. We'll collect all the questions and ask everyone at Zoom to ask the questions themselves at the end, or if you ask your question on another medium, we'll ask the question for you. Okay, I think, no, there's one thing I would like to remind everyone of, that in October, at October 20 and 21st, we have our end of the year symposium in which we try to wrap up our whole lecture series, and registration has been closed, but for the keynote speakers, we still invite people to register. So this can be done, or more information is found on our website. Okay, I think that's been more than enough talking from my side. So I would now like to give the floor to Narly. Narly, thanks for being here.
Thank you very much for the lovely introduction, and thanks a lot for having invited us to contribute to this series. We are very excited about it. It's a great chance to exchange thoughts and talk about what we're doing and the kinds of topics that are interesting us, in particular in Giulio's project right now. So today we'll talk about our work on combining prosodic and syntactic information in the brain during naturalistic speech listening. So it's work that's in progress, but we thought it would be, nonetheless interesting in the context of the main topic of this Leipzig Lectures on Language. I'd also like to say that we're doing this work in the context of a relatively recent National Center of Research Competence. So it's an NCCR in Switzerland that started last year on the topic of the evolution and future of language. And the work we'll present to you falls within one of the work packages called Prosody to Meaning, where the goal is really to understand the relationship between prosody and syntax, actually, more specifically, with other studies within that work package as well. So the specific study that Giulio will present today is being done in collaboration with Alessandra Rampinini, who's a postdoc in the lab and a linguist by training, with Paola Merlo, who's a computational linguist at University of Geneva, professor of computational linguistics, and with Peter Donhauser, who's kindly shared his NEC data with us and who's collaborating with us on the project. So in this study, we hope to address the question of how prosody helps speech comprehension, and more specifically, how it may or may not be combined with or even help to boost syntactic processing in the brain. So this specific research topic is an extension of some recent computational modeling work that's been done in the lab on the neural encoding of acoustic information. And it specifically asks, again, the question of how linguistic and paralinguistic information are processed in the brain at higher level within sentences and likely more abstract levels of representation. So unlike some of the other talks that are being presented within this lecture series, we don't focus on how words are combined to produce syntax, so on combinatorics per se, but rather on how different levels of linguistic and paralinguistic information are combined in the brain and may boost one another to enhance the processing of respective relevant features. So this question is relevant to the topic of evolution of language because nonverbal vocalizations by non-human species, even though they don't contain lexical items as we know them, they do carry meaning by their very intonational and rhythmic properties. So this may be the evolutionary precursor of affective prosody and maybe also of linguistic prosody in human language. So here's a brief overview of the topics I'll touch on before Giulio presents the project itself. These are a selection of the topics that were shared with us by the organizers, and you'll note that I reformulated the second question so that it fits within our, adapted it to our study. So I'll start with kind of a very broad view on the question, then I'll focus on some background computational modeling work that we've done on this topic, but at the lower level of the speech signals, so on acoustics and phonetics. And then I'll talk a little more generally about the kinds of cutting edge methods that could be useful for bringing us further. And then Giulio will talk about how we're extending these approaches to prosody and syntax, and we'll explain how we're tackling this question empirically in brain imaging data. So the first question is, what information do we combine in language? So I think we can all agree that spoken language contains information at different levels of granularity, starting from the acoustic information contained in the speech signal to the phonetic contrasts that are used to contrast meaning in a particular language, so phonology, to syllables and lexicosemantic items at the suprasegmental level, and then to sentences in natural speech. And we can, I think, agree that as we move from these more acoustic to the higher levels of linguistic information, one becomes increasingly more removed from the underlying acoustic information to progressively more abstract, atemporal, and possibly amodal representations. And to add to this, the speech sounds themselves are made up of simultaneously fluctuating spectral and temporal modulations that occur at different frequencies over time. And these complex layers of information are processed during natural speech continuously over time, as I said, with interactions happening between the different levels that help us to put the information into context, and in particular, for example, with respect to paralinguistic information such as affective prosody, audiovisual interactions in the case where we're watching the person speak the utterances, context and predictions, and so forth. So this brings us to the second question in the initial overview. So how does the brain combine these different levels of information? We believe that one of the mechanisms underlying this is the boosting of the neural signal underlying the processing of specific joint features. And this can be either within or between linguistic levels or in specific contexts. So the amplification of these jointly processed features probably comes about from functional interplay between different components of the relevant brain networks. So we recently demonstrated such boosting of relevant features in a study in which we asked whether the auditory cortex encoding of speech sounds is modulated according to the task that's being performed on the sounds. And so we think that this speaks to the question of how we combine information or make sense of information in the brain. So in this fMRI study, it was a 7T study, we had participants perform either linguistic or paralinguistic tasks on the very same set of stimuli, and these were non-words, which contained phonetic information, phonological information, but no semantics, no lexical semantics. And the question we asked was whether the low-level auditory encoding is modulated, so of the acoustic features is modulated depending on which aspects of the sounds people are attending to within the two tasks. So in one task, people heard these pseudo words and had to decide which speaker or which voice was pronouncing the pseudo words. And in the other task with exactly the same stimuli, they had to detect the presence of target phonemes. So in this case, it was stop consonants p, t, and k. And in order to move forward with the analysis, we first characterized the stimuli themselves with respect to information like spectral and temporal modulations contained in these pseudo words to build a sound representation model. And then we trained a multivoxel decoder to reconstruct the acoustic energy of every acoustic feature as defined by that sound representation model. And this was done for different regions of interest in the brain within the temporal cortices, so superior and middle temporal cortices, also including early regions like Heschel's gyrus. So the decoder was defined for each region of interest separately and for the two tasks separately, but using the same sound model. And then we compared the reconstruction accuracies for the speaker and the phoneme task to see if and how they differed. And interestingly, our results showed that with the identical stimuli and with the identical sound representation model, the different sets of specific features were reconstructed better depending on which task was being performed. So first I'll talk about the stimuli. So what we did, we first performed an acoustic analysis of the stimuli themselves. And we found, as we expected, that the higher spectral modulations best differentiated the three different speakers from one another. And conversely, that the high temporal modulations and also energy in the lower spectral modulations preferentially differentiated the stimuli containing the different target phonemes. And this is not surprising because, as I said, the target phonemes were stop consonants, which contain very rapidly changing information. So we expected the differences to be within the higher range of temporal modulations. And interestingly, the fMRI results showed a similar pattern across the tasks. So specifically, there was an amplification within the auditory cortex encoding of these sounds. There was an amplification of the higher spectral modulations during performance of the speaker task, and an amplification of lower spectral modulations and of higher temporal modulations during performance of the phoneme task. So in other words, we found that the neural response patterns during the performance of the respective tasks are modulated in a manner that's largely consistent with the very acoustic features in the stimuli that are critically relevant for performing the two tasks. And interestingly, we found these effects even within the early auditory regions, so Heschel's gyrus. And we believe that this modulation is arising due to top-down effects from higher order regions involved in processing speech sounds and in processing voice information. So this is a little bit the background work that we would like to talk about. So the next questions coming from that previous work are, how do these higher level computations, what higher level computations within speech might be bootstrapped onto acoustics, onto acoustic information, such as contained in prosody, for example, changing at a slower rate rather than as in contrast to the speech sounds. And what's happening at the suprasegmental level, so at the sentence level or within phrases. And how does this relate to higher level information in the speech, in the language, so in the linguistic content itself, that's more abstracted away from the acoustic features themselves. So for example, syntax. And again, we're specifically interested in how syntax and prosody are combined, or how prosody can potentially boost syntactic processing or assist syntactic processing. But before getting into that, with Giulio, we'll talk to you about that. I'd like to say a little bit about what kinds of methods could be useful for advancing these kinds of fine and complex questions that we're interested in. So we've been thinking about this question a lot, given the growing use of machine learning approaches and also of multivariate analyses for brain imaging data analysis within the cognitive neuroscience. And together with my collaborators, we have an opinion paper that's in preparation, where we propose that model-based decoding approaches strike the right balance between being relatively data-driven, so still allowing the potential to uncover unpredicted results, unexpected relationships between dimensions or features of interest, while remaining interpretable. And yeah, again, this is challenging in the context of our specific questions, because we're trying to relate features that are more ingrained in the stimuli or more linked to the actual physical parameters of the stimuli to more abstract ones. And yes, so in this opinion paper, to elaborate a little bit, we've taken some examples from research within the language neuroscience, cognitive neurosciences, that have been, taken to study brain functional organization for speech and language. And basically traditional approaches, such as general linear models, involve the use of controlled experiments to tackle specific questions. And so together, different approaches using GLMs have shown, they've revealed a neural architecture where low-level features such as spectral temporal modulations are transformed along the cortical hierarchy to incrementally construct abstract linguistic structures. Then we have other types of approaches, including, for example, representational geometry approaches, multivariate pattern analysis, for example, that are also that are in this case data-driven. And these kinds of approaches have been used, for example, to show that large numbers of semantic features in naturalistic stimuli are selectively, they're distributed actually broadly across the brain. The issue with this type of an analysis and approach is that the interpretation of the results can be difficult, and the results can be relatively descriptive rather than mechanistic. And then finally, more recently, there is a growing interest in the use of encoding and decoding approaches. And we propose that using model-based encoding or decoding approaches can be good, because this constrains the kinds of interpretations that can come out of the analyses. So as such, these approaches can be, again, good in terms of being relatively more data-driven, but still ingrained within a model. And again, this is now just a depiction of one of the figures in our paper, where we consider processing stages of a simple contrast, phonetic contrast, like a BADA categorization task, for example. And one can see from the existing literature that the spectral temporal decomposition happens in early auditory areas, like primary auditory cortex, and then phonological processing, the spectral temporal encoding specific to phonological units is localized more bilaterally within posterior STG, superior temporal gyrus, and then phonological feature processing may be more localized to the posterior STG in the left hemisphere, and finally decisional processes may be taking place within more inferior frontal gyrus, for example, left inferior frontal gyrus. And along this processing hierarchy, information is encoded through hierarchical parallel and recursive processes. So yeah, and an important point again with respect to using model-based approaches is really to an issue to keep in mind within research on speech and language is that different features of interest occur at different timescales. So speech sounds occur over, stop consonants are faster than vowels, syllables occur over a slightly longer timescale, and then words, of course, on an even longer time scale, and so forth. So basically, all this to say that the modeling approach ought to be adapted for the temporal granularity of the level of speech processing that's being examined. And again, we think that one good solution in terms of having analyses, studies that are innovative but also interpretable is potentially to adapt models according to the known architecture of the brain networks that are being examined in the study. So I will now pass on to Giulio, who will take over from here. So I'll stop sharing.
Do you see the great mountains? Yeah, okay, great. Perfect. Okay. Hello, everybody. My name is Giulio Degano, and today I will talk about our new project investigating the interaction between prosody and syntax in the brain during naturalistic speech comprehension. So, as we know, prosodic information can be characterized by, prosodic information usually characterized, for example, by intonational information, is typically considered to be paralinguistic. But it is known that it can in fact also be valuable in aiding the processing of high-level linguistic information, which is what linguistic prosody usually refers to. In fact, it has been shown that infants make use of prosodic information to acquire the grammar of the native language, and this phenomenon is known as prosodic bootstrapping. So the importance of prosody in early language processing is also supported by research showing that newborn babies are able to distinguish languages coming from the same rhythmic classes as their native language, and from ones coming from different rhythmic classes. This is likely due to in utero auditory experience with the rhythmic and intonational properties of the native language speech signal. Here, I will use the term prosodic bootstrapping a little bit more broadly to refer to how prosody might assist syntax comprehension even in adulthood, as it has been shown that even later in life, prosody can disambiguate syntactic information, for example, in ambiguous sentences. Moreover, neuroimaging work has also shown that syntactic and prosodic information do interact in the brain. For example, a recent study from Anastasia Glushko showed that the neural tracking of speech signal is boosted at different timescales when prosodic and syntactic boundaries are coherent. That being said, the interaction between syntactic and prosodic processing in the brain has not been investigated extensively, and most of the current research has explored this relationship with specific paradigms that do not necessarily reflect naturalistic environments. But I say this because in our field, there is a growing interest in the brain processes underlying more naturalistic speech processing. This type of design, of course, has the drawback of including a greater number of confounding variables, but have the great advantage of reflecting what is exactly happening in the brain in real-life situations. The recent increase in computational power has brought great benefits in neurolinguistic research, and promising results have advanced our understanding of neural signature underlying the processing of different levels across the linguistic hierarchy. However, the majority of these studies have investigated these levels independently. So our goal is to look at how they interact. More specifically, we have first attempted to understand the amount of information in the brain that is shared between prosodic and syntactic features during listening to naturalistic speech. And we're going to do this in our first project by first looking at the temporal aspect of this interaction. by then looking at high temporal resolution brain activity from MEG data. Luckily, the team from McGill University, composed by Peter Donhauser, who is also a collaborator on this project, and Sylvain Ballier, shared their data, where they investigated the naturalistic processing of the speech signal across 11 participants, where they listened to 4 different TED Talks across 7 different runs. At the end of each run, they exposed the participant to a simple questionnaire just to understand their general comprehension of the TED Talk. And so they basically seated in the MEG scanner, just listening passively to the speech stimuli. This type of experiment, of course, gives us a lot of power in terms of the amount of linguistic feature that we can decide to model from our speech signal. But there is also the drawback that they're also hard to define. In our case, we need to define a set of features for both prosodic and syntactic information. This type of information is also laying a completely different level in terms of abstraction. On one side, we do have a set of features that is embedded in the physical properties of the stimuli, such as prosody. On the other hand, we have a model that needs to model a type of information that is way more abstract. And on top of that, we also need to evaluate this set of features in the brain. So we need to find a way how to map these 2 different types of data. As Narly already clearly explained before, this is not easy to do. There are different options, and also the interpretability of the results does change a lot. We can, for example, try to decode our linguistic features from the MEG signal and see how it will interact, or vice versa, which is a bit more common, try to encode this linguistic feature doing just a linear regression on an MEG signal. But there is also another way I will talk about more later, which is using mutual information. So I will first talk about how we define our features in our experiment. So here we start with prosody. As I said before, it is way easier to extract this type of information from our speech signal. And here we decided to go with 2 different sets of features. One is envelope, the other one is speech. The first one is basically a representation of the fluctuation in intensity of the speech signal over time, whereas speech reflects instead the fluctuation, the spectral information of our speech signal. Both of these features are very easy to extract with a simple spectral temporal analysis of our speech signal. Of course, as I said, it is completely another type of work to extract the syntactic information from our corpora. Indeed, syntax does lay on a completely different level in the linguistic hierarchy. And also it's very hard to model it automatically from a naturalistic stimuli. Moreover, and most importantly, of course, there are different linguistic model to define syntax, and the usage of syntactic rules involves several interactive cognitive processes. What we decided to do is to use 2 different types of models to define syntactic information. One more linguistic based, and the other one more statistically based. And I will start first explaining what we did with the latter. So in order to extract the statistics of syntax, we decided to use a state-of-the-art transformer, which is basically a neural network that gives us prediction of the word in our text. What I mean by that, here in the example, you can see in the bottom the inputs of our text and the output of the neural text of the neural network. In this case, for example, about is going is read that GP2 there is a prediction of happiness. So this type of model gives us a prediction of the incoming word. So how do we extract syntax from this? Well, we can be smart about it. We took our actually idea from a very nice work from Misha Helbron at Donder Institute, but we can use this type of prediction by grouping them based on the part of speech. What I mean by that? Here we have the example that you will see a lot in the next slide, that everybody talks about happiness, these, and there are the different output of the neural network, days, day, way, things, etc. So here days has a high probability because the neural network has decided that days is the most likely word or token that's going to come after the end of this sentence. So what we do at this point, we group all of these different predictions based on the part of speech class, and we can then obtain this matrix on the right that is defined by words of the words of our corpora by part of speech class, and gives us the predictability of the part of speech. Again, in our example, we have everybody talks about happiness these, and after these, we can see that there is a high predictability of a noun. So the neural network is super sure, and the next one is going to be a noun, which doesn't make sense. From this, we can extract a statistical measure of these predictions of part of speech. And we decided to use entropy to measure the predictability of the time of the part of speech. So entropy goes very low if the predictability is, the prediction is very, very certain. In this case, again, after this, the neural network is super sure about the decision, so the entropy is low. On contrast, when there is a lot more uncertainty, the entropy goes up. As for example, at the beginning of the sentence in everybody. As I said previously, this is a nice work from Misha. For the second set of features, we decided to use a linguistic based model. And so we fed our corpora through an NLP parser. In our case, we use Spacey, that goes through a specific pipeline in order to understand all the dependencies across the word in our corpora. And here we have the usual example. Everybody talks about happiness these days. You can see all the relationships that are automatically done by the NLP parser with very good results. What we decided to do in this case, and to represent this type of information, we represented each word in our set with the number of left dependencies. This is still a kind of a rough way to represent, of course, the dependency tree, but it has already shown interesting results in a recent work from Alessandro Popolo, neurobiology of language. Now, as I said, we have two different sets of features that we want to analyze. So on one side, we have the syntactic ones that contains both linguistic-based models, approaches, and another one more a statistical type of model. So we have information about our dependency tree and the entropy of the part of speech. On the other hand, we have the prosodic features. In this case, representing the spectral fluctuation in pitch or the intensity fluctuation in the envelope. And now comes the second challenge, how we want to map this into the brain. As Narly said, we can try to decode this type of information, and there are different ways to do that. But we, as I previously mentioned, we decided to go with a information theory measure, which is mutual information. That to some extent, I think it's a really powerful tool because for the set of features that we're interested into, knowing that, we can make, sorry, the mutual information is the measure of the prediction we can make knowing the set of features of interest. In this case, I report again the entropy of part-of-speech. So the mutual information between the entropy of part-of-speech and MEG is the amount of prediction that basically you can make about the MEG signal, knowing the entropy of the part-of-speech. And this is a very useful tool if you want to start doing some what is called partial information composition. So we want to assess the amount of variance explained in the MEG data by prosody, syntax, and also other type of entities that we talk about now. So if on one side we can define, for example, what is the unique part of prosody, so the amount of variance that the MEG signal is explained by prosodic features, we also can decide we also can define the unique information given by syntax. So the amount of variance of the MEG signal explained by syntactic features. But also, more interestingly, we can also check the redundancy between these two sets of information. And by redundancy, I mean the representation in the MEG signal or the variation that are common between prosody and syntax. This is very interesting because we can indeed compute the amount of information of the brain signal that is shared or common between these two features. Our preliminary results show that, as expected, the neural response that is unique to prosody occurs early, around 100 milliseconds, and appears to be localized in bilateral auditory regions. Those that are unique to syntax, occurs later, and as expected from previous decoding work, are more spread over time, probably also reflecting the predictive top-down aspect of syntax processing. But more interestingly, the redundancy between prosody and syntax appears to be localized bilaterally and occurs in a broad time window that also overlaps with the early effect of prosodic encoding. Our results thus suggest that temporal areas at early middle latencies reflect not only the processing of the acoustic information, but also encode the representation of the set variance characterizing prosodic and syntactic features. We can speculate that this might be done, this might be due because of the top-down influences given by the syntactic predictions. But also, it is still a bit hard from this type of statistical interaction, which is redundancy, to infer about the interaction between prosody and syntax in a more regression point of view. So our results do not show that the encoding of syntactic information is indeed modulated by prosodic features, because our measure is more of a reflection of the type of information that is shared between the two. So based on the results, we can go a little bit further and try to explain this fully this interaction in a more broad sense by, for example, trying to decode syntactic components such as phrases or relational dependencies from our brain data, and we would expect that the decoding should get a temporal advantage. And what I mean by temporal advantage is the decoding might be better or happen earlier when syntactic information co-occurs with a prosodic landmark. So further analysis of this effect should be investigated via MVPA analysis on the syntactic information contained in the naturalistic stimuli, and we are planning to do that. One thing that we cannot ignore, though, is that syntax is related to meaning. And we think that we must then extend our framework on semantics, as it has been shown that prosodic cues can also help listeners differentiate word meaning and even enhance semantic memory. So our natural next step will be to understand how semantic context can interact with acoustics, or even how prosody can favor the disambiguation of meaning in the brain. Thank you very much for your attention.
All right, thank you, Giulio. I think that was very wonderful. Thank you for the talk. Thank you, Narly, as well. I would like to start with a question, if I may. Prosodic cues are, of course, distributed throughout the sentence, throughout speech. So prosodic cues happen all the time. But some prosodic cues will be particularly relevant for syntax, for syntactic processing. So I imagine that the overlap that you showed differs quite a bit depending on the sentence context and the type of sentence as well. Some sentences may be ambiguous and really require prosody to disambiguate. So do you make a distinction there, or did you just collect everything, so treat all syntactic environments as one, so to say? Can you say a little bit about that?
So yeah, no, that's a fair question. No, so for our first analysis, yeah, we pulled across all of it. We didn't differentiate. Sorry. The first main reason is that I was very scared about the variance of this, because yeah, it's pure naturalistic stimulation. So it's that talks, and the beauty of it is that you cannot control for it, but also that's a bad thing that you cannot have the variance that you want. So for sure, though, we are planning to be smart about it and still using naturalistic simulation in the future and try to model these different scenarios and different syntactic constructs where prosody can be more helpful in a more controlled-ish experiment. Yeah, but for this specific case, I pulled across. Yeah.
Maybe I can add to that and say, Giulio, in your preliminary analysis, you did look at pitch differences with respect to left dependencies, and there was an effective sentence type, right, interrogative versus affirmative, which is expected. So that's a super basic thing to start with. But of course, as Giulio said, this is sort of our first, way of looking at it. But this is where it gets interesting, is then, looking at linguistic models, more specific empirical results from the psycholinguistics literature, for example, where we would then look and try to pit specific features against one another if we have enough of variation along those dimensions in our stimuli. And if not, the next step is to follow up with a more controlled experiment.
Very nice. Okay, thank you. Then I would like to invite Helmut to ask a question. Helmut.
Yeah, thanks for the great talk. Very nice work and also a great talk. I have one question, and I think you mentioned it at the end. With these naturalistic sentences, whatever they are, naturalistic, but whatever, you mentioned the problem that you don't only have syntactic prediction, but also semantic prediction. Because there is something, as I understand, also one of your measures of syntactic prediction or syntactic classification is something like overall predictability. So did you look, I missed the point, but did you look at the difference between the two measures, one of them being more syntactically oriented and the other one being more globally oriented, as I understand it, because you have these two measures of your high level, as you call it, prediction value?
Yeah. We haven't had the chance to do that yet, right? So Giulio, to look at the two syntactic features, the two sets of syntactic features, we haven't done that yet. As we mentioned, this is very preliminary, and Giulio got these last results presented only a few weeks ago, so there's a lot to be done, but that would be one clear obvious extension. And yet another would be to then incorporate yet another syntactic model to really pit syntactic models against one another and see where you get better performance in the brain data.
Looking forward to what comes out of the data. Thank you.
Which I can add, like I find it it's kind of a rabbit hole, to be honest, because sometimes we lose the focus on prosody syntax interaction because there is so much about syntax that needs to be investigated, and comparing these different models is super interesting. And well, also one of the talk from Professor Hale, he clearly explained that he is really looking for like the process, algorithmic process that match at best the brain activity. So we tried as a first attempt not to go too much in that rabbit hole, because we realized very soon that it was really complex, but super interesting. Yeah. Sorry.
Maybe to add, that's also why we have linguists on board, and we are open to collaboration. So if there are people that have ideas of things we can look at, that's the beauty of also data obtained during naturalistic, listening to naturalistic stimuli, is that you can then extract whatever features you're interested in, right, and model those. So we look forward to getting, input and expertise from people who feel like they're interested in getting involved.
All right, thank you, Helmut, and thank you for your answers. I would like to ask one other question, which is maybe an invitation to speculation, and I'm afraid it comes from a more experimental, so controlled experiment approach, rather than your new naturalistic approach. I was comparing this to your Narly, the first study that you presented, and I was wondering this amplification of specific acoustic features depending on the task. Do you think that maybe something similar may be happening with acoustic features important for prosody, depending on how important prosody is for syntactic processing? So I can imagine that one speaker uses a lot of ambiguous structures that require prosody to parse the sentence, whereas another speaker may be doing using abundantly many syntactic cues, morphosyntactic cues, and with that already disambiguating its sentences. Do you think that already at primary auditory cortices you will have amplification similar to the phonemic amplification that you saw?
I believe so. I believe that, yeah, if you were to contrast those examples that you gave, yeah, I really think there's this online modulation that's going on constantly in our brains as a function of what's important and what's missing. And you see that also in the speech and noise literature, where you see differential effects for like the first and the second language, where the L1, you can compensate for the loss of the degraded input because you just have so much more context, it's so much more automatized. So yes, I do believe that you would see similar effects. And in fact, that's what Giulio, so at the very end, that's what those were the next directions we'll be taking, even within this context of naturalistic stimuli, by looking, he's going to use, maybe you want to elaborate a bit more, Giulio, but to see whether in parts of the stimuli where prosodic and syntactic features co-occur, and they don't have to be exactly at the same time, there can also be like a lag, because he's going to do like a lagged analysis with multiple lags, then we would expect a boosting of, for example, syntactic processing during specific points in relation to the prosodic features, or vice versa. So that's exactly what he's going to do. But of course, if we had a complementary approach, would be to design stimuli where you can manipulate the degree of ambiguity or predictability, for example. And this is something we've also played with, but we decided to start with this more generalizable approach.
Okay, thank you very much. Then I would like to invite anyone else to still ask questions if there are questions. I don't think so. So then I would like to ask both of you one more general question that we have been asking all our speakers so far. So Narly, this one is for you. What do you think is the most important challenge? Oh, I'm sorry, this is all live. I just received one more question in Zoom. So we'll cut first to the question regarding the talk. So this is from Gilbert. Gilbert, maybe you would like to ask your question yourself? If you are online.
Well, okay, I can do it.
Oh, there we go.
I wrote it out because I didn't know if I should read it myself. So this is probably more a comment than a question. So I must say the study was fascinating. I really there's much in it which I don't understand because I'm not coming from the brain study field, but I'm a phonetician. So I'm wondering, as I understood it, you use two acoustic features in order to estimate prosody. One which you may call the envelope of the signal, and the other the fundamental frequency contour. So from my perspective as a phonetician, both of these signals, of course, also encode other information than prosodic information, like segmental information. And at the same time, there's prosodic information in the signal which is not captured by these measures, like for example, durational differences. So my question is basically, is this your final word on these measures, or are you planning to and somehow to further develop them, your choice of measures? Sorry.
If I may, yeah, no, absolutely not. It's not our final word. One of the beauty of our current project with the NCCR is that we also have access to a lot of very good expert, especially also on prosodic information, prosody in general, prosodic processing. Sorry, and we don't want to stop there. And of course, we want to characterize our model of prosodic information in a more fine grain. So sorry if it's just saying yes to your question, but definitely we want to extend that. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Gilbert. And then, if there's no other questions from the audience, then I will go to our general questions. So, Narly, what do you think is the most important challenge for the field? For our field for the next, say, 5 or 10 years?
That's a big question. Yeah, I mean, I think I communicated part of it maybe in the presentation, is really to we have more and more powerful imaging methods and also analysis methods, data storage capacities, and so on. So we get so much data, and it's very tempting to just throw it into these deep learning algorithms and kind of see what comes out. So I think a challenge is really to just like the brain does, moving up and down between the low level and the high level, really go have analytic, sort of very focused empirical questions, but keep it within a synthetic, broader context to be able to really understand the neural basis of speech and language processing more holistically. Now, of course, if you pit it that way, then it goes even further. There's the multimodal, the question of multimodal integration, affect, we're human beings, so everything happens in a very broad context. So yeah, no, I think that don't know if I have a very specific answer, but I think the challenge is really to find the right questions, because there are lots of tools out there. So finding the right questions in order to really understand, push the envelope of our understanding underlying the mechanistic processing of speech and language processing at different levels of representation and how they interact. So the mechanisms, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. And then for our junior, this was a very long answer, so this might make your job a bit difficult, Giulio. We always ask, how can the junior researcher contribute to solving this challenge? So, what do you think?
So I think the beauty about well, neuroscience in general, but also the neurobiology of the language, is that now we are at a point where we have people with so different backgrounds. Like, for example, I'm an engineer, but I also collaborating with a linguist in my lab. So as junior PI, I think we can, PI, sorry. Junior researchers, I wish. I think we can contribute by really taking our background in maybe in computational, more computational background, more psychological background, linguistic background, and really merge it together, because this is really what I think we are pushing towards, right? Like as already been mentioned in one of your talks, the mapping problem, so merging neuroscience and linguistics. And I think using this type of methods, using people that collaborate together, especially young researchers, that we have now this opportunity. So that's how we can help to do that. Yeah. I don't know if, yeah.
All right, thank you very much. Thanks to both of you again for joining us today and for your talks. I think I can thank you on behalf of all the people joining us on the different platforms today. And with that, I would also like to welcome you for next lecture, which will be on September 29th. And this will feature Bingjiang Liu and Lorraine Tyler. So thanks again, and have a great afternoon, evening, or morning.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
I guess I leave.